Hello, everyone, and welcome to Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. I'm your host, Bill Cannon. I'm a retired NYPD homicide sergeant, did almost 27 years. And today, I have a very special guest, Detective First Grade Michael O'Keefe, not just a detective, but also an author. Michael's written a novel called Shot to Pieces, A Reckoning in Brooklyn, a short story book called 13 Stories, and a novella called Not Buried Deep Enough. And today, what we're going to talk about is a little bit unusual. We're going to talk about the Netflix special that they did, a documentary on the Ripper murders in England that occurred in 1975. And the Ripper murders lasted from 1975 to 1980. Obviously, a serial killer. And we're gonna sort of put the investigation under a microscope. Also, the documentarians, I think I can call them that, they made this a little bit political. They claimed that the investigation was tainted by sexism and classism. And Mike and I both have been involved in real big investigations. So we can tell you a lot about the investigation, and we can weigh in on whether the fact that this perpetrator wasn't arrested for 5 years, whether it had anything to do with sexism and classism. Mike, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Bill.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You've been on the show before, and you're a knowledgeable guy. Now, you watched the documentary, right, Mike?
Yeah, I did. I actually I made a point of it last night watching it.
And just give me a bird's eye opinion on what you saw.
Well, keep in mind 30, 40 years ago that this occurred, and I watched how the England Metropolitan Police handles a serial murder investigation, and I wasn't terribly impressed.
No, there
were a lot of
there
were a lot of problems in the investigation.
You know, Mike, I just wanted to read something that was talked about by the people who made the documentary.
Mm-hmm.
Her name was Ellen Woods and Jesse Vile. And they said, or people that critiqued this, they said the series highlights the prominent sexism and classism at this time, as both the police and the press failed to give proper attention to cases that involve women who were sex workers or lived in poverty. This dehumanization contributed to and enabled the perpetrator to evade capture for over 5 years. Thoughts?
Well, it wasn't classism, obviously, because they created a task force right after the first murder, and there were a minimum of 145 cops and detectives working on it. So obviously, despite the fact that they identified the first victim as a prostitute, the fact that she came from poverty and was a sex worker they spent an awful lot of money trying to solve her homicide. The original case that started off what we know now probably wasn't his first attack, but it was his first murder. And
the first victim, Mike, is a woman named Wilma McCann.
Yeah.
She was 28 years old. She had 4 children.
Mm-hmm.
And you're absolutely right. There was a horrendous case that occurred in 1969 where he attacked a prostitute, and he didn't kill her. And the police caught him, and she didn't want to prosecute, so they let him go. Right. This guy graduated 5 years later to becoming a serial killer.
Which is actually one of the weaknesses in the initial investigation. Once they identified it as a serial murderer, as investigators, we understand you don't have filet mignon your first time out of the barn. Maybe you have a few French fries first. So go back. He graduated to murder. He didn't start there.
Right.
And the other aspect of the case, based upon the crime scene, it was clear that he was staging his victims. Well, this is a development. This is a developed fantasy that he's trying to fulfill. So clearly there are going to be fits and starts that occurred before that are going to be other indicators, things that you can look at. Cruelty to animals, for instance, is usually
A sign of a serial killer. Yeah, a sign of a serial killer.
Bullying.
Mike, explain to our audience what staging is.
It's basically setting up the corpse or the body in the crime scene in such a way to fulfill a picture in the killer's mind. He's trying to fulfill a fantasy.
Or to shock the investigators.
That too, or in some instances to mislead the investigators. I mean, all of these
it's usually displayed in a sexually provocative way.
Right. And yet all of these victims, none of them were sexual. There was no sexual abuse in the commission of these murders. They appeared to be sexual in nature.
Right.
And ultimately, and we don't know because they didn't discuss the psychology after the fact when they finally caught this guy and debriefed him. It doesn't seem like they ever got into his emotional modus operandi. Why did you do this?
Right.
Never mind how. We know how. We have all the evidence in crime scenes.
Right.
Tell us why. And I don't believe that was ever explored.
Mike, let me just also touch upon the difference in 1975 as compared to now 2021.
Yeah.
And both of us have worked hundreds of homicides, right? Mm-hmm. And technology has helped tremendously in homicide investigation. For example, there are video cameras all over the place now, all over the world, right? Everywhere. People have cell phones. Cell phones are a walking, talking GPS device. Mm-hmm. So for the victim and the perpetrator, they come into play lots of times in a homicide investigation, as you know. And then those three letters that changed the world of investigation, DNA. And that didn't exist in 1975. One of the things that would do today, if someone was ever successfully do 13 murders, it would link the cases together so that you would know you had the same perpetrator committing these crimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's actually what they counted on back then was blood grouping. And even in the narrowest blood grouping, you're still talking about 30% of the population. And ostensibly, it took them until those fake letters were sent before they got a sample that they could do blood grouping.
Let's hold
and he
off
wasn't
on that.
The guy.
Mike, let's hold off on that for a while because that's okay. Really interesting. But when you talk about blood grouping, I was like, when they mentioned it, 50% of the population was O, 25% was AB. Mm-hmm. So there's 75%. And then the rest was split between A and some other rare blood types. So it was almost like, for elimination purposes, if you had O blood, you could eliminate, how many people, 50% of the population have O blood.
Right.
So it doesn't really help you all that much.
No, narrows your talent pool a little bit. That's all.
Yeah. Whereas DNA is so precise. And now with something
specific to one person.
Yes. And now with genealogical DNA,
that's frightening.
We can use something called familial DNA to actually find a perpetrator whose DNA wasn't maybe recovered, but we can bring it up through the family tree.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing, right? Well, now let's talk now, Mike, tell our audience about the MO of this killer. And his name was Peter Sutcliffe. Let's talk about his MO.
Okay. Well, Peter Sutcliffe was, they called him a lorry driver in England. That's a truck driver, but it's local deliveries. He's basically driving a panel truck. So he's very familiar with the roadways all around Yorkshire. He worked for a trucking concern in Yorkshire. It's a poor neighborhood. There's a lot of sex workers. There are red light districts and clubs that prostitutes generally go to. So basically the area that he worked and lived, it's kind of target rich for a serial killer. If you're looking to get, and not necessarily prostitutes, just women on their own out in the street, this is a great place for him to hunt. And his MO was he would encounter a woman on the street, whether she be a prostitute or someone else, engage them in conversation. And at some point in the crime, either in his vehicle or out on the street, he bashed them in the head to knock them unconscious.
With a hammer, right? With a very
With a
specific
hammer.
implement. Yeah.
Yeah, well, they ended up recovering several hammers that he used. But with a hammer, he would take them to a location where he wanted the body to be, and probably post-mortem would mutilate them with various knives and screwdrivers and continue to hit them with the hammer. I mean, he did some hellacious damage to some of these victims. What they discovered with some of the bodies when they would find them is he would go back because the bodies weren't found, and he would move them to a more public location and stage them there. So this guy wanted his work to be discovered, while obviously he didn't want to be discovered himself. He wanted to continue to try and fulfill that fantasy, that picture in his head.
Right. And there's just a picture of the Ripper, and at some point they were able to make a wanted poster because as you know, Mike, being an investigator, the best witness is a surviving witness. A dead body can tell you something based on the forensic evidence, possibly, but the best witness is an eyeball witness. And the eyeball witness created a tremendous sketch that looked just like this picture of him.
Mm-hmm.
We'll go back. This is a surviving. I think she provided
this was
a great
girl that they discounted, though, because she wasn't even remotely similar to a prostitute or a sex worker.
And Mike, let's talk about that too. And we spoke about it off camera before. Let's talk about investigative tunnel vision, which this case, rather than say the lack of success in this investigation was because of sexism and classism, let's talk about investigative tunnel vision as being one of the things that prevented them to do a better investigation than they in fact did.
Yeah, well, initially they got trapped into locking into a mindset for the killer and assigning an emotional state to him that they don't know actually existed. His initial victims, or at least the ones that were killed and were found, did have some involvement in prostitution. Doesn't mean that he hated prostitutes. If anything, he hated women.
Right.
I mean, to dominate them and mutilate them before and after death. Obviously, there's a rage there, but I don't think it was specific to prostitutes. And later on in the investigation, the police missed out on an opportunity to interview living witnesses because they discounted them as being part of the pattern because they lived and they weren't sex workers.
Mike, which is the worst thing you can ever do as an investigator.
No,
right?
You have to broaden your mind.
Right. You have to have an open mind and start out here. And then as you get a suspect, you narrow your scope. But in the beginning, and if you don't have a suspect, you have to have an open mind. This could be anybody.
Right. Well, they were so locked in on the prostitution angle early on in the pattern when they were doing door-to-door interviews of all basically everybody in the Shire. They spoke to him and they asked him, do you frequent prostitutes? How do you feel about prostitutes? Do you like prostitutes? They were so locked in on the prostitute aspect. And while we don't know because nobody ever asked the question, he might not feel one way or another about prostitutes. The fact that they were involved in prostitution might have never come into his consideration.
Although, Mike,
they were available targets.
He was quoted when he was arrested, and he may have just played into this because the press fed this to him too. He said, "God sent me on a mission to kill prostitutes." But that was the narrative.
That was later for court. That was done with the benefit of him speaking to counsel, and they were going for an insanity plea. And it was only then that he introduced the idea that he had any animosity toward prostitutes. So it was basically, I mean, that was handed to him.
Yeah,
Either by the
that's what
press
I'm
or his
saying
own
is that,
attorneys.
and that's why, people always ask us, why do you hold things back in an investigation? And that's a perfect example of it, because the press was feeding him
Yeah.
this prostitution thing that, oh yeah, I'm only killing prostitutes, but holding back information and evidence is important. So when you finally do get the perpetrator, you have something to interrogate him with.
Well, because they were so forthcoming with the facts of each crime, they had the letter writer claiming to be Jack the Ripper. And then they had the voice recording that got sent to the investigator. I'm still not content that they're the same people. I am content that neither one of them was Sutcliffe.
That's
But I
what
don't know if the letter writer was the same guy that sent the voice recording. They could have been led down the primrose path by two separate people that had nothing to do with the crime.
Mike, this is what you're talking about. They reproduced the letter on a billboard, right?
Right.
And in addition, they recorded the recording that they were sent, which purportedly was the killer. And tell us what that turned out to be.
Well, it turned out to be basically a nut that read the paper and wanted to insert himself into the investigation.
And again, that's
but
why.
Here's the thing, keeping an open mind, I'm not content or convinced that the letter writer was the guy that sent the tape. I am convinced that neither one of them had anything to do with the crime. These were the leads that the investigators ultimately got trapped into following, while more bodies piled up and up and up. And they were looking for a guy with an accent. Meanwhile, there were living victim witnesses that they discounted as being part of the pattern, who would have thrown that tape right out the window. They would have, because he didn't have a Georgia accent. He had a Yorkshire accent because he was from Yorkshire.
You know something, Mike? We've been on cases where people that are of a very high rank call shots from 10 miles away from ground zero, from where the investigation is taking place.
Yeah.
And they, in fact, because of ego, do not listen to the investigators, do not listen to the detectives. Instead, like on this case, they come up with a theory that, no, this is who did it. Right. And that's called, again, investigative tunnel vision. And you want to touch upon that?
Yeah, well, in the NYPD, we're fortunate. We have, the chief of detectives is ultimately in charge of major investigations, but they'll create a task force and they'll put an inspector and a captain in charge of it. But for the most part, the detectives and the frontline supervisors, the sergeants and the lieutenants, are given a certain amount of autonomy to investigate the case. And the bosses accept what they're being given because they know that the detectives, the field detectives, are on the street wearing out their shoes to get this information.
Right.
So the idea of this high concept, this theory coming from the palace doesn't occur in the NYPD to the level that I saw in this particular case. You had, and I said it to you, and it's the thought that keeps going through my mind. The moral of the story is, don't let police administrators run an investigation. They're not in the right lane.
But yet that occurs all the time, even to this day. And they make decisions that are not correct,
Yeah, they want things that don't have anything to do with the case. What's nice, though, on the field, though, when I was doing my homicides in the 8-3, I would address their concerns, but it was basically treating them like mushrooms. I fed them shit and kept them in the dark and did what needed to be done on the case.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they got a DD5 to pamper their whim, but for the most part, the case went the way that I directed it. And my bosses were on point with me. I mean, I didn't lie to them because they're down there in the grime with me.
Right.
But, when you start getting to the point of the inspectors and the chiefs and the super chiefs, yeah, okay.
Well, let's talk about, even from the point of view of running this investigation and from a patrol standpoint. Obviously, if you were the head of patrol, you would have been paying very much special attention to the red light districts, maybe even put a couple of undercovers out, maybe a female cop dressed as a prostitute, which in this case could be a tremendously dangerous operation. But, you know, has backup, also pulling over cars, pulling over trucks that are in the process. It didn't seem like all that much was done with that, you know, although they seem to have a ton of paper, but it was like misdirected paper.
Yeah, it was, you know, you couldn't see the forest for the trees. There was so much paper. But the only time that it looked like they were trying to approach this investigation from the ground, one of the living, and unfortunately, she was the surviving witness who had a brain injury and couldn't remember anything. Only once did the detective go into the bar where she was accosted from. Other than that, I didn't see any, like you said, that no undercover. Why aren't you running a John operation?
Right.
If you think the guy is killing prostitutes and picking up prostitutes, why aren't you running a John operation? Why aren't you putting vehicle descriptions out or having your patrol force from this time to this time, every time you see a male and a female in a car, why aren't you pulling them over and identifying them, making your presence known? At the very least, you're going to get some suspects.
Roadblocks. How about roadblocks?
Roadblocks would work also.
You know, after a homicide happens, shut everything down.
Yeah.
Chances are you're going to pull over, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the case, the Beltway sniper.
Yes.
They were stopped a few times before they got caught. They were stopped, but there was another, you talk about investigative tunnel vision. In that case, it was the big white panel truck, which did not exist.
Right.
But that
they were shooting out of the back of a Caprice, right?
Yes. That became the false narrative, which became, in that case, investigative tunnel vision. Right. And in this one, it was the voice on the tape and the person writing the letters to the chief of police who was running the investigation, who had such bad tunnel vision that a detective came into him with the perpetrator who looked exactly like the flyer, Peter Sutcliffe. And
he told the chief he didn't like his answers.
And the chief screamed at him.
Yeah.
Get out of my office.
He threatened to bounce him to traffic for the rest of his career.
If he doesn't have this accent and if he doesn't know this and doesn't know that, get the hell out of my, that's horrendous. That's a horrendous type. As we say, again, to beat this to death, you have to have an open mind when you're doing investigations, not closed mind. It's, oh no, it can't be him because he's not tall enough. He's not heavy enough. He's a little too light. He's a little too dark. It can't be him.
They largely because they had so very little evidence to begin with. When they got the letters and they got the tape that they so wanted to be the same guy and wanted both of them to be the killer, they hung their hat on that because it was something tactile, something they could talk about in their press conferences. Mm-hmm. When ultimately they both turned out to be red herrings and maybe separate red herrings. They weren't evidence at all. They were frauds.
Right. But when we talk about physical evidence back in 1975, of course there could be blood evidence. And one of the things we all know from working homicides is that when someone kills with a knife or a sharp-edged instrument, usually they do what?
They cut themselves.
Exactly.
More often than not.
Exactly. So,
and particularly a crime of this type of brutality, that blade's flying all over the place. He's cutting himself.
Right. So his blood would probably be commingled with the blood of his victims.
Yeah.
But again, there was no DNA.
No DNA
back
at
then.
the time. Yeah.
So very difficult. But so many things were done wrong from an investigative standpoint. And when you talk about, someone just wrote in the live chat, the biggest two words in investigation is task force, and that's how they think is going to solve everything. A task force, But sometimes, and I've said this on other shows, that more is not always better. If you have 100 detectives, they're going to be tripping over each other.
Yeah.
You got to weed it down to 10 or 15 guys that know the case. Mm-hmm. And, they know everything about the case. And, task force, that's why there's weaknesses to that. They don't always work,
Right. Right.
But, when they talk about also the classism, first of all, hello to these documentary makers. When they talk about classism, most violent crime is done in poor neighborhoods. I'd hate to just remind you of that if you didn't know that. Well, they're using 2020 mores and 2020 politics for a 1975 case.
The other thing is what blows that argument out of the water. Yes, these were poor. The victims were poor, for the most part, poor or middle-class women in this poor area where the crimes are occurring. They spent an awful lot of time, an awful lot of manpower, and an awful lot of money not caring about the poor. I don't see it. It's just not there. The argument doesn't hold. And with respect to sexism, all of the victims were female. All of the assets that went into catching this guy, and they did I don't think they were particularly good at it, but they spent everything they had to try and catch this guy through the course of the pattern. Where some of these documentarians, the feminists, their comments, they were told women are in danger. From this time to this time, it's not a good idea to be out unescorted. You should go in groups. They talk about it as if it's a curfew. It wasn't a curfew, or there wouldn't be 13 murders.
No, but
nobody was infringing upon their freedom. They were just giving them a heads up. This guy's killing women.
They spoke as if that was a sexist thing for the police to give them a heads up, like maybe women should stay off the street between 8 and 10 in this area because we have a serial killer loose.
Yeah, it was advice. It wasn't.
Well,
it wasn't an edict. It wasn't policy.
If
they told
law. If they told me a serial killer is killing 6'1" handsome white Irish guys that are in their 60s between 8 and 10, I'd stay off the street then. I wouldn't say it was sexist.
Right. Well, along the same lines, I was a sophomore in high school when Son of Sam was running around New York. My offensive line coach from Brooklyn, and he was just always in a bad mood. And finally we asked him, "Hey, coach, why are you always in a bad mood?" And he said, "If the cops don't catch this Son of Sam, I'm never getting laid again." Her father wouldn't let his girlfriend out of the house. So that's why he was in a bad mood. Now, nobody told her, except for her father, that she couldn't go out while this guy was killing people. But she probably wouldn't have gone out anyway. Because if you're in the target group, you're in danger.
But except, they had some information even during the Son of Sam case that I think turned out not to be true, that he was just targeting women with long brown hair. I think that was just who he found in the lovers' lanes. It just happened to be probably most women have long brown hair.
I think one of the victims, it might have been Stacy Moskowitz, actually had short hair.
Yeah. So that was, again, investigative tunnel vision and false information.
But they were on the right. They were on the right track that he was striking at lovers' lanes near clubs, near discos. So consequently, they were looking for some sort of traffic information, and the focus of their investigation was in the right direction. And ultimately, they got a tip regarding the car, and then they had to basically hunt down the cop that wrote the summons, and that's how they ended up getting him. But they didn't have tunnel vision. That was actually a very well-run investigation. Who knows how many people would have been killed if they weren't on point as much as they were.
But Mike, let me just stop you for 1 second. One of the things that we look at as police and as investigators, especially bosses who are running large-scale investigations, is we look at things that are patternable. Days of the week. Is there a pattern to the day of the week this person is striking? Times. Time can tell you a lot of things. Oh, he's hitting at 8 o'clock at night. Maybe he just gets out of work. He's on the way home. He's taking this specific road because he must work around that area. He's hitting, this is done a lot with rapists, Maybe a rapist, he's going inside. Maybe he's the delivery guy, So all of these things, you can make certain assumptions based on patternable things, and what is patternable, as I said, time, day, dates, all of those things can be patternable. And of course, again, you come up with MO, which is modus operandi. We use acronyms in the police department. We think everyone knows what they stand for, but that's Latin for method of operation, so MO. And then there's also something called signature, which is a little more in depth, the way someone commits a crime, And in this guy's signature was he used a screwdriver to stab instead of a knife. It was a sharpened screwdriver.
Well, he used both, but what they noticed, there were circular stab wounds that they attributed to a Phillips head screwdriver. So the combination of the screwdriver, the knife, and the hammer, I mean, he made it very plain he was guilty of all of these crimes. It's just, he didn't make it hard for them to figure it out because it was present, the pathological information available to the detectives was all right there. He wasn't hiding anything.
And I'd like to talk about, there's another thing. At a couple of the crime scenes, he left a boot footprint.
Yeah.
Now, we know that in investigation and in evidence as the bottom of a boot can be something called class characteristics. And today, if it's a specific boot, what's the famous boot everyone wears?
Timberland.
Timberlands.
Yeah.
A Timberland boot has a certain bottom to it. And different brands of Timberland boots have different bottoms. And believe it or not, these companies keep catalogs of the bottom of what their boot looks like. I don't know if they did that in 1975. So that's a class characteristic. And then there's
in this particular case, that was a very common bottom. It's basically a construction work boot. You didn't have the broad spectrum of boot companies that you have today.
Right.
Back then, basically everybody who wore construction boots was everybody that did a manual labor job, drove a truck, anything of that nature. But they did classify the boot prints, and they noticed there was a uneven amount of wear on the right boot. So they had a signature from the boots.
Mike, I was getting to that. There's class.
Sorry about that.
And then it's okay. There's individual characteristics.
Yeah.
If you stepped on a sharp object and it left an indentation in your boot, that's unique to Michael O'Keefe's boot, his right foot, because he stepped on a sharp metal object and it left a gash in the bottom of his boot. So if you're a serial killer and you step on someone and leave an imprint of that boot in the dirt or on their body even, or on their clothing, the first thing was class characteristics, and the second is individual characteristics, which is tremendously strong evidence.
Right. But it didn't appear that they were looking, that even the suspects that they were speaking to, did they ask to see their boots? Did the individual detectives doing the interviews, were they even apprised of the fact that there's boot prints as evidence available? There was just this. The problem was the information was centralized and available only to people who weren't actually on the street doing the investigation.
Right.
That's,
Mike,
if you're not told something, you can't know it.
Mike, one of the things that I like to tell people, because there's a lot of people throughout this, YouTube world and all the social media that are doing these real crime shows, and many of them really don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
And I'd like to tell people this is how it's really done. And a lot of times I would run a large investigation, and I would have all the detectives in for a briefing, and me, myself, the lieutenant, the captain, we would run the investigation. And it's one of the most important things to do, and this too, is at the change of every tour is to have a briefing on all the new personnel that's coming in to work at nighttime.
Mm-hmm.
And you let anyone speak who wants to speak. Any investigator that talked to anyone, did a DD5, collected evidence, results of evidence, you let them speak in this meeting, because that's the only way investigators can get up to speed on what's going on.
Mhm.
The secret squirrel shit is no good. And you know what happens because you're laughing.
Yeah.
Some guys that want to make a splash, I'm not going to tell everyone because I'm going to go get that guy tonight. That's the worst thing any investigator can ever do.
No, there's something worse. I worked with a guy that did this. Before you come to work, even though he wasn't working on your case, he read your case folder, and then he sneaks into the boss's office and he whispers red herrings in his ear. And then you come in and you have to talk the boss off the ledge for an hour.
Yeah.
And tell him that doesn't apply to this case. You've been lied to. Don't let everybody read my case folder. It's between you and me and whoever's working with me.
No, you're right. I've seen people do that with the chief. Chief,
Yeah.
This is what I think happened. And you're like, dude, why don't you shut up?
Yeah.
You have nothing to do with this. And you're pissing in this guy's ear. And then we got to deal with it. And by the way, Duty Ron, thank you so much for that super chat. Michael O'Keefe and I are buffing out with this investigation. And it's good to be the one critiquing rather than having people critique us, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because we've been on the other side of the critique. And a lot of people out there listening to this have been on the other side of the critique. But this is a fascinating case. And we're coming at it basically because the people that made this documentary made specific allegations of sexism and classism. And perhaps there was some of that relative to the prostitutes, but it wasn't the only problem. There were investigative problems here.
Yeah.
And hello to the documentarians. We just wanted to inform them that most crimes happen in poor neighborhoods. So if you want to say classism, well, most violent crimes happen in poor neighborhoods. I'm sorry to inform you of that, but that happens to be the truth.
Two poor people, by the way. Majority of victims of violent crime are the poor themselves.
Absolutely.
Within the community. So, I didn't see a lack of effort or care on the part of the investigators. I saw a lack of professionalism in that they weren't sound investigative. My big problem, again, is top of the food chain isn't doing the investigation. The information that was needed for the guys on the ground was never getting down there. And too much information was going out to the public. Which,
Mike, you're preaching to the choir. Hallelujah. Yeah. I love that because people ask us all the time on these real crime shows, why shouldn't the community know everything the police know? And you just hit it on the head because it compromises the investigation. Totally compromises the investigation. Cat in the Hat, thank you so much for that $10 super chat. This is fantastic. As I said, whenever I get a super chat, I feel like a pole dancer, but in a good way. In a good way, I feel like a pole dancer. So Cat in the Hat, thank you so much. Yeah, so Mike, there's so many things with this investigation that, look, any case that's lasting for 5 years and people are getting murdered, the community and the press are going to be outraged. And something, police departments react to the press.
Yeah.
And sometimes the press really can hurt investigations because the pressure that they put on the police department. For example, on the NYPD, anything happens in Central Park, they want to call in the National Guard. They want to call in an airstrike. It's just because that piece of property is so highly political that any crime that happens in it, the police department gets tremendous, tremendous pressure from the politicians above.
Yeah.
And we'd also like to dispel the rumor, and we'll tell you this outright. No murders are treated the same way. And believe it or not, and we'll tell you this outright, and this is the truth, and if you don't believe it, you better believe it. According to where the murder occurs will dictate how much attention it gets. And that just happens to be a fact. And the police department, the mayor, they'll all deny this to the end of time, but it happens to be true.
Well, that's an example of what classism does come into it. The interesting thing about it is, however, because we are decentralized the way that we are, the actual detectives doing the investigation in the poor neighborhood that isn't getting any press still care. We're still working.
You're right. The detective.
I don't care if City Hall cares also. I don't care what they care about. I have a murder. I have to speak for that dead person.
That's right.
I
That's
don't
right.
need the mayor to tell me that I need to speak for that person. I've made an oath. That's what I do.
100%.
Politics notwithstanding.
You know, Mike, I've had murders of like young kids. One time, I remember we had a 13-year-old kid was stabbed in the projects in the 2-3 by a 16-year-old kid, and I took that so personally. I couldn't sleep. I was at work at before everyone else got there, and I just worked that case so hard. And I was the boss, but I pushed the detectives to the point, they were like, "Hey, Sarge, back off a little bit." And we solved the case. But the kid was 13 years old. And to see a 13-year-old lying dead on a gurney, that has an effect on you.
It's a terrible waste.
Yeah.
So.
Crazy. So, yeah, no, you're 100%. The investigators take these things so personally, and they're going to work as hard as hell on a case. But I'm just saying the politics of investigation, and it exists,
Yeah, well, if you're investigating what is basically regarded by the government and the media, by the high muckety mucks in the police department and the media as a low priority case, you're not going to get all the manpower, all the assets, all of the money. You're not going to get all of that. So you're going to you're going to work with what you have.
Mike,
you're not going to work any less hard.
Mike, someone said I need money for my light bill, but what I didn't anticipate was I was using natural light, and it started to get dark during the show. Yeah. So now I'm turning over. Anyway, that was Duty Ron. Duty Ron, thank you very much for the $20 super chat. And I did pay my light bill. I just didn't realize that it was going to get darker outside. Mike, we're at actually 41 minutes, and I said I wanted to cut this off at about 45 minutes. Any last thoughts? Wrap this up.
Well, the one just as a television viewer, the one embarrassing moment I was actually cringing were when the big bosses had their press conference after they finally got this guy, and they were giddy like schoolgirls. "Oh, we're very pleased. We're very pleased."
Yeah.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
Yeah, it is they wanted to bask in the limelight of it. I love that expression. Success has many friends, and failure is very lonely. And that is so true.
The original quote is, "Success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan."
Yeah, I love that quote. I just love that.
Yeah.
Tiffany Marie, thank you so much for the super chat. I'm getting all these friends through my buddy Duty Ron. And as you can see, I have some superstar guests. This is Michael O'Keefe, first grade detective, author of 3 books. I don't know if he'll mind me saying this, but he's the Michael O'Keefe of the Washington Heights riot fame. He actually fought for his life with a perp 30-something years ago, a perp named Kiko Garcia, who wound up not winning the fight. Mike won the fight, and that's why he's here today. And so he's the Michael O'Keefe of the 3-4 riots that happened a long time ago, and I'm proud to be his friend. And I'm proud to have had him several times on the show, Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. I want to thank all of our Patreon fans, all of our YouTube fans. I want to thank Duty Ron, who's been hooking me up with a lot of his fans. His fans are now following Police Off the Cuff and Real Crime Stories. And 2021 is going to be a great year for Police Off the Cuff and Real Crime Stories. And I'm going to bring in superstar guests like you see right here, the retired detective, first grade, Michael O'Keefe. Mike, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill. I had a lot of fun talking about this.
It's always fun. And thank you everyone for watching. And I'll see you the next time. We're not done with this case. We're going to talk about it a couple more times, maybe even with Mike. We'll get into more of the individual homicides and the evidence and what occurred. Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks again from Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. I'm your host, Bill Cannon. Thank you.